Frustrated Kenyans continue to protest online. The decision on Friday by the International Monetary Fund to approve a new 3-year financing arrangement for Kenya valued at $2.34 billion. They say that Kenya is already over-indebted. The lender said Friday that the package is intended to help the African country continue responding to the COVID-19 pandemic and address its debt vulnerabilities. According to the Central Bank of Kenya, public debt in East Africa's largest economy stood at $67.5 billion as at the end of January. Announcing the bailout deal, the IMF said that Kenya debt remained sustainable but was at high risk of debt distress. The lender appealed to authorities to focus on their near-term agenda on urgent structural policy challenges. Approval of new loans under the fund's extended credit facility and extended fund facility will enable immediate disbursement of $307.5 million that Kenya can use for budget support, adding to $739 million that it received in emergency COVID-19 aid in May 2020. The East African nation was hit hard at the onset by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has disrupted the country's economy. According to the IMF, with a forceful policy response, the economy has been picking up heading into 2021 after likely posting a slight contraction of 0.1% in 2020. Now, Economist David Owiro is Executive Director of Africa Development Think Tank, and he joins us now on Zoom from Nairobi in Kenya to share his thoughts on this bailout deal and calls for the IMF to print money for poor countries. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Why are Kenyans up in arms with funding that's designed to help them out of COVID-19?
Very good question. I think the bottom line is that Kenyans are frustrated. They see their economy as being poorly mismanaged. And, they haven't seen the results of all the previous debt that has been taken, including the COVID-19 debts that were taken on. They haven't seen that impact. And lastly, they are under a huge stress of taxes because government has been, increasing its tax base, trying to raise more revenue amidst ever-widening budget deficits year on year. And so Kenyans are indeed a frustrated lot.
Just how indebted is Kenya? Give us a ballpark figure, perhaps as a percentage of GDP, something that can give us a sense of just how in distress the country is.
Well, it's not yet in distress, but the stock of debt is currently standing at about 100% of GDP.
100%?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
But that would suggest almost insolvency.
Well, the metrics upon which the IMF uses, they do something called debt sustainability assessments. And so these are basically looking at key ratios of, crucial debt indicators. And so according to them, we are still sustainable because our debt is still sustainable because we still have the ability to pay. And you can imagine the level of annual debt repayments stand at almost 70 billion a year. And so we are still capable of making those repayments. And so that is the comfort which they hide under. But the reality of it is that, we are really on the brink of debt distress. Because if you look at the options that government has in terms of raising the money in order to pay this debt, and also the opportunity costs of the debt repayments that we are making, the social sectors are suffering. For instance, if you look at the provision of education, social services such as healthcare services, amongst others, such as even construction of critical infrastructure in the rural areas, all these are suffering. And so Kenyans continue to, fall under a heavy burden of taxes. As you saw the statement from the IMF, much as it's talking about fiscal consolidation, which should really be about rationalizing your expenditure, they actually do have a preference for revenue-based reforms. And these basically are, more consumption taxes, which Kenya has had enough of, and has a huge impact on the marginalized people, because it really affects people across all sectors when you have consumer taxes. And, the import of it is that the cost of living has been increasing, ever so slightly. And in the end, you can then understand the frustration that a lot of Kenyans have, and the venting that they're doing right now on social media.
So the question then becomes, what will this funding do? What can it do?
Really, the merits of it are not too convincing, because they talk about putting in place, more, or enhancing the COVID response that they have in place, both from a public health perspective and also from an economic stimulus perspective. The question that most Kenyans are asking is that, what are you really doing with the money? What is the impact of this borrowing? And, Kenyans cannot identify the projects upon which they are implementing with these funds. And, alongside that, there has been major scandals which have come to light with the main government medicine supplier called the Kenya Medical Supplies Agencies. There's a lot of corruption that has come, a lot of sort of tenderpreneurship has happened, and it's really the political elite who are benefiting. At the same time, the core, people who should hold government to account, namely Parliament. Parliament also, is decrying that, much as we see what is happening, there's really nothing they can do, because the Parliament is beholden by the executive. And so from a structural point of view, in terms of debt management, we are really in a dark place, because there seems to be no movement forward. What the Treasury says, or the executive says in terms of implementing, key reforms that are required, only remains to be so on paper. In reality, they still continue with an expanded expenditure program, also, amidst trying to expand the taxes. And really, even the debt reform that Kenyans have called for hasn't really been pursued in terms of trying to reduce the amount of debt that we have, and also the debt repayments that we are making annually.
When the IMF hands out cash, they don't just say, here's money, do what you want. Surely there are controls and reportings that are required to make sure that these funds are not abused.
That is presumed to be the case. But what we found out, as especially civil society actors, is that the IMF and the National Treasury seems to be talking from the same side. As you saw, they recognize the reforms that the government is implementing, and they acknowledge the measures that government has put in place to raise more revenue. However, the reality in the country is quite different. The Kenyans are crying for more accountability when it comes to debt management, in terms of the transparency, but also in terms of the impact of that debt. In terms, when they deploy this debt, when they put on those projects, what is the efficacy of all of that? And, lastly, what is the role of institutions? Because we have critical institutions which play a critical role in debt management, which have sort of dropped the ball, so to speak. And so really, it's quite confusing with regard to the stance that IMF has taken versus the reality that Kenyans are experiencing.
What should government be doing to get the country's economy kick-started and moving forward?
Well, there's a number of things that government can do. I think from a debt perspective, the first starting point is to begin rationalizing the debt that it has. A lot of our debt is basically external and largely commercial or non-concessional debt. And this tends to be quite expensive, and also it tends to be due in a shorter term time periods. And so this drive up the repayments quite a bit. And so what government should enter, the kind of program that government should enter into, is to sort of seek for debt relief or debt restructuring. And this will involve, a lot of bilateral and multilateral discussions between Kenya and its lenders, so that rationality can come in, as well as have greater transparency, greater governance in terms of the debts that's taken on, so that Kenyans can see the utility of that debt, because at this point Kenyans are not seeing that. And lastly, of course, is broadly about economic management. Part of the problem that we are in right now is because of poor mismanagement, that a poor job that government has done over managing the economy. Much as we show our potentially high recovery rate compared to our peers in the regions, there's still quite a bit of room that Kenya could make going forward. But that there doesn't seem to be a concerted effort in government to try and move Kenya forward from a management perspective. And so, to my mind, I think those are key starting points that can move us out of this sort of potential debt distress situation.
All right. So what is the likelihood of a default in the near future if the country carries on, A, borrowing at this rate, and B, perhaps managing less than they ought to be?
Actually, the scenario that is likely to happen is that public services will suffer, and already they are suffering. We've seen public sector workers already downing their tools, issuing strike notices over the last year because their salaries have been delayed, or they're not getting the right equipment or the right support that government should give them in order for them to do their work. And so already we are seeing service shortages as a result. And so when this happens, government is essentially trying to fulfill its debt obligations at the cost of public service delivery. And so, in the end, Kenyans are the ones who suffer because they will not get those critical services that they require. Secondly, what is also likely to happen is that government will, continue with its plan to increase taxes. And these are essentially consumption taxes. And consumption taxes have a cross-sector impact. And it ends up, raising cost of living and making things more expensive. And so with in the face of declining incomes and loss of jobs that COVID has brought about, and even the wiping out of complete sectors and segments of the economy, Kenyans will further feel the burden. And this can actually put us into a downward spiral that compromises even the little GDP growth that we were seeing. And so government has to, also consider putting in place not only a social protection program that tries to, help the vulnerable segments of the population that are exposed to COVID, but also to sort of spur and kickstart the economy. And this economic stimulus has to be real. And, ordinary Kenyans have to feel it. And that often has been the challenge with the previous economic stimulus that government has put in place, because, it's often cosmetic and it doesn't, address the key challenges that we are facing. So there's a whole bouquet of items that government needs to do in order to get itself out of, away and mitigate the risk of debt distress as we see it.
Mr. Owiro, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening and your valuable insights. Thank you.
Thank you so much as well.
All right, that's David Owiro, who's Executive Director of Africa Development Think Tank, speaking to us from Nairobi in Kenya, a country that's just received more funding from the IMF. The lending institution says that Kenya is still sustainable and good for that debt, despite it having a debt ratio of 100% to its GDP. Very, very alarming. All right.